Hi, I'm Ray Middleton, a reflective practice and PI developer at Fulfilling Lives and Changing Lives in the northeast of England. And here's a series of very short films to help with reflective practice. And what I'm going to do is introduce some theory from research about what does help when you're working with people with complex needs. That's when people have combinations of serious mental health problems combined with alcohol and drug problems, homelessness, maybe offending. And that group of people with complex needs often have more than the average amount of trauma and neglect in their past, and less than the average amount of skills to deal with life's difficulties. And the reaction to that combination of things often leads to complex needs developing. And then services are engaging, maybe homeless services or mental health services, other kind of services then engage and try and help people. And often there's a lot of emotional wear and tear on the staff on the front line. And one of the things that can help with that is reflective practice. And there's a model of reflective practice which is about meeting up with other people. You can journal as well, but it's more effective if you talk to other people, reflect with peers, colleagues as well, is particularly useful. And there's a cycle of learning. So if you think about a cycle of learning in reflective practice, the first thing is you could describe an event, an experience that you had, maybe an interaction with a client that you were trying to help, and say how you felt about that. So that's the first thing, describe the experience. And then the second thing is to evaluate that experience. So you might say, well, what was good about that interaction? And what could have been better? So you're evaluating it. And to evaluate something, you need to do that in the light of something that you think is good or that you value. So you could do that in terms of the goal of your service, what you're trying to achieve by coming to work and helping people, or a value, what are the values of the service that you work for, or your personal values about you trying to do a job where you're helping people with complex needs, and you might evaluate it in the light of that. Or you could evaluate it by drawing on some theory, some research evidence around what helps. And that's what these short films are going to do, is I'm going to introduce a topic each time from the theory and research around complex needs about what helps. And that's one of the things that in that cycle you can then reflect and talk with other people about your practice and think, well, how does that relate to the theory and the evidence? So I'll introduce a kind of top tip or about what helps working. Okay, so the first bit of research and theory, a guy called Professor John Livesley, you can Google him if you're interested, and others have summed up a lot of the international evidence around working with complex needs. And what they've found is it's very, very common for staff to get outside of their role and their limits, or boundaries is another name for your role and your limits, or your role and your boundaries. So between my two hands here, imagine that's the job description of what you're trying to do. And what the research finds that when services work with people with complex needs is staff go in two ways. They either start to do more than their job description, and they get outside and start doing things that are not within their job description, and then they get burnt out, really. There's a lot of emotional wear and tear. They start to make unhelpful decisions with their other clients because they're doing too much, and they often don't realise this unless there's a very healthy reflective practice culture in the service about trying to reflect and think, actually, am I getting outside of my role and limits here? Because the other thing that people do, because there's a lot of push and pull and people feel, staff, and I've felt this, is often feel maybe anxious about the work, or they feel annoyed or fed up or frustrated with some clients. And that's normal to feel those things. But if there isn't the space to reflect and kind of process those feelings and stay optimistic and hopeful about the clients, people either start doing too much without realising it, getting burnt out, and then they're off with stress, etc. Or people start to do less and less than their job description. So say if you were supposed to see a client once a week, you start to see them once a fortnight because unconsciously or consciously we feel it's quite difficult to see that person. I feel uncomfortable. I don't feel very confident. I feel a bit nervous maybe about seeing them. So these two things happen. And that's about trying to maintain your role and your limits or boundaries in your job. And so that's a bit of theory around what happens normally, is that they get pushed and pulled. So another way to think about this is to think about our role as between these two, our role and our limits as between these two lines. So that's us. And what tends to happen is that we're working with people with complex needs, and because of the increased amount of trauma and neglect in their past, and they find boundaries difficult because they've had their boundaries crossed a lot. They might have had inconsistent messages, and so they're often not too sure about their own boundaries, and other people's. And so what happens is that often workers start to get outside of their boundaries for various reasons, but maybe we're feeling pushed and pulled emotionally. We might be getting our buttons pushed. Some of the issues the clients have might be resonating with our issues we've had in our past, for example. And so we start to go outside of our role and our limits or boundaries and that can lead to problems, because if we're doing things outside of our role, we end up getting burnt out, tired, we end up getting quite stressed. We start to make not very good decisions about our other clients and with our colleagues, and our relationships suffer because we're feeling stressed and anxious and overworked. And so this is a normal thing that happens, is that people get outside of their boundaries, or the other thing research finds is that sometimes, because it's difficult work to build relationships with people, sometimes staff feel overwhelmed and anxious, and other sorts of difficult feelings get stirred up, and so staff go the other way, and they sometimes start to do less than their role. So, for example, if your job description was you saw someone once a week, you start seeing someone less than that, say once a fortnight. And consciously or unconsciously, you might be thinking or feeling, I feel a bit overwhelmed, I'm not very hopeful about this person, they make me feel uncomfortable when I'm with them, I'm not very optimistic that they're going to get better. And so staff start to do less than their job description. So what we really want to do is, by reflective practice with others, we can bring ourselves back and think, well, it's normal to have our boundaries pushed and pulled emotionally, because understand why that is. People have had difficult experiences in their childhood where their boundaries have been pushed and pulled, and they're not sure and invalidating. We want to be consistent and more or less try to maintain our role and our boundaries or limits by chatting to people. And you can see how, by reflecting with colleagues, if we're starting to drift over here and do more than our job description, it helps us think, oh, hang on a minute, I'll just come back and I'll be more effective, and my own mental health and well-being will be better if I stick to what I'm doing. And if I think, oh, I'm doing a bit less, I'm avoiding this person, and then I can think, oh, I wonder why, and you can go back and start to maintain this boundary more or less here by reflecting with others. And this can also crop up and help to explain a lot of confusion that happens between services as well. So if the client you're working with is also working with a staff member from a different service, they've got their boundaries to maintain as well. And then what can happen is that staff get a bit confused because they think, oh, why are they doing my job? They seem to be going outside of what they're supposed to be doing. And this causes a bit of tension and confusion. Or else you think, oh, that other person from that other service, they seem to be doing, they're over here, they're doing less than what I think they should be doing in their role and boundaries. And the antidote to this confusion, which can lead to a lot of conflict and misunderstandings and break down a relationship between staff and services working with the same client, is to do reflective practice with people from other services and with the client. So you can reflect and think, oh, I'm a bit confused or a bit concerned that you seem to be doing this, and I thought this was my role. And they might not realise that, and they go, oh right, yeah, this is what I do. Or I'm a bit concerned about, I thought you would be doing this, but you don't seem to be, and I'm wondering why. And that allows them to reflect, and they think, oh, I wonder why. And they can have that, so communicating and reflecting around your role and your limits or boundaries with clients and with staff and with your colleagues can help you maintain your role and boundaries. But it also helps to understand that having a role and our boundaries or limits pushed and pulled is part of the work of working with people with complex needs, because they've had their boundaries and limits confused and damaged in the past. And so if we maintain our boundaries, it helps them to learn about their boundaries and about having healthy, kind of staying well mentally and healthily like that. And so you could reflect on that bit of theory now, and you could have a discussion about in your job, and you could describe some experience and how you felt about it, working with a client, and you could evaluate that experience in the light of this theory that's saying that people's role and limits gets pushed and pulled and people do less or more than their job description, then get into difficulties, that's normal. But you could reflect on that theory and evaluate that interaction and that work with a client, and you could say what was good about that work. Maybe they wanted to see and that was really good and they wanted to build up that trust and relationship. And what wasn't so good, maybe if you got out, did more than your job description at times, or if you started to do less because you were feeling a bit, wanting to defend yourself, feeling a bit overwhelmed. So you could, and reflect with other people. So peers is a really good kind of, create a safe space where you can reflect with someone else. You could do that in a group, or you could do that on a one-to-one over 2 or 3 minutes, cup of tea, and you could just chat to someone and say, oh, do you think sometimes we do a bit too much or a bit too little, less than our job, and why is that? So that's about reflecting on the theory with other people, and you can take an open dialogue approach, which means that you value other people's points of view. So 3 principles from open dialogue which are dead easy to apply and are really helpful in reflective practice would be to accept that we only partly know what's going on ever, and so we can open up and value different points of view. So that's worthwhile reflecting with others to see how they can see things we can't, and we can listen to how they see an issue. And lastly, that we take responsibility for our role and limits within a social network. So you can see how they apply really well to reflective practice. And the final thing of reflective practice is you can think, well, what would I do differently or better as a result of reflecting on this? So there's a bit of theory to introduce into your reflective practice circle. So I hope you found this video helpful. Reflective practice is just one of 6 key points in psychologically informed environments, or PI. The others being about evaluating what we do, about having a think about the social and physical space that we're in, and also about a psychological framework of some kind, thinking about the reflective practice, and also the training and support for staff, and concentrating on the quality of relationships. And that's how reflective practice fits into PI, but this series of films are just concentrating on reflective practice. If you found it helpful, do post a comment or send a link to a friend, a colleague, and most importantly, have a chat with the ideas in this film with a colleague and actually get involved in some reflective practice and think, well, how can I learn by sharing with others and improve my skills? And that creates a learning culture. Thank you.